The last time I drove through Cedar Falls, Oregon, I was 18 and leaving for college with a full scholarship, a duffel bag, and the absolute certainty that I would never come back. The town looked exactly the same as I remembered it, the grain elevator rising above the tree line, the hardware store with the hand-painted sign, the same 3 stoplights blinking in sequence down Main Street. But I wasn't 18 anymore. I was 29, 7 months pregnant, and driving a car with a cracked windshield and $43 in my checking account. I pulled into the parking lot of the old Feed and Grain, turned off the engine, and sat there for a long moment with both hands on the wheel. It wasn't supposed to go this way. I had a plan. I had always had a plan. Finish my nursing degree, get hired at a hospital in Portland, build something real with Marcus, the man I had loved for 4 years. The man who proposed to me, on a Tuesday evening with a ring he said his grandmother left him. I believed every word of it. I believed all of it right up until the morning I told him I was pregnant, and he looked at me with something I can only describe as inconvenience. He didn't yell, he didn't even raise his voice. He just set down his coffee mug and said, "I thought we agreed we weren't ready for this." I reminded him we hadn't agreed on anything. He reminded me that his lease was only in his name. I was out of his apartment within a week. I stayed with a friend, then a coworker, then a motel I paid for by the night until the money ran out. I had 3 job offers rescinded when my condition became visible. I applied for hospital positions in 4 cities. No one called back. My landlord in Portland sold the building I'd rented for 2 years and I had 60 days to vacate. The week I packed my last box, my father called to tell me my grandmother had passed and left the house in Cedar Falls to be sold, not to family to pay off her debts. There was one person left. One name I had been circling for months, coming close and then pulling away like a hand near a hot stove. My Aunt Ruth. My mother's older sister. We hadn't spoken since my mother's funeral, which was also the day Ruth told me that I reminded her too much of the sister she'd lost to bad decisions and worse men. I was 16 at the time, and I took that to mean she wanted nothing to do with me. But I was out of options. So I drove 400 miles on a prayer and a quarter tank of gas, showed up at her door with my stomach preceding me by several inches, and knocked. She answered in a gardening apron with dirt on her hands and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked at me. She looked at my stomach. She looked back at my face. "I knew you'd come eventually," she said. "Everyone comes back to Cedar Falls eventually." She did not invite me in. She did not step aside. She stood in the doorway of her tidy Victorian house on Elm Street and said, "I have a routine, Claire, I have a garden, I have a book club on Thursdays, and I do not have room in my life for whatever this is." She gestured vaguely at my midsection. "I am too old to be anyone's safety net." I didn't cry. I was too tired to cry. "I just need a week," I said. "Maybe 2. I'll sleep on the floor. I won't disrupt anything." "You're already disrupting things," she said, and closed the door. I stood on her porch for a full minute before I walked back down the steps. My lower back was aching. My feet were swollen inside my shoes. I had nowhere to go and approximately 3 hours of daylight left, and I was standing in a town I hated in front of the last door I knew how to knock on. I drove to the end of Birch Road and pulled over near the river trail because I didn't know what else to do. I sat there with the window down, listening to the water, trying to breathe through a wave of something that was half panic and half grief. Then I heard a dog barking somewhere close and a woman's voice calling it back, calm and unhurried. I got out of the car because sitting in it felt like giving up. The woman was maybe 65, maybe older. She was walking a large, unruly golden retriever along the trail and losing the argument about which direction they were going. She had short silver hair and the posture of someone who had once been very tall and had simply decided to remain that way. She saw me leaning against the car and didn't look away the way most people do when they spot a very pregnant woman clearly in distress. "That dog," she announced, "is completely out of control, and I love him entirely too much to fix it." She tugged the leash. "You look like you've been crying." "I haven't," I said. "You look like you're about to." I didn't have a response to that. She introduced herself as Dot Calloway. She had lived in Cedar Falls for 30 years, she said, after retiring from a career as an emergency room physician in Seattle. She had moved here for the quiet and the fishing, and because, at 62, she had decided she was done with places that moved faster than she wanted to think. She asked me if I needed somewhere to sit down. I said I was fine. She raised an eyebrow in a way that suggested she had spent decades listening to people say they were fine immediately before they were not. My guest room has a proper bed, she said. I made it up last month for a niece who cancelled. It'll go to waste, otherwise. I can't just. You're not just anything, she said. You're a woman in the last trimester, standing on a trail in March with no jacket and what looks like everything you own in the back of that car. Come have dinner. You can leave after if you want. I didn't leave after dinner. I stayed 3 weeks before the baby came. Dot was the kind of woman who communicated primarily through action. She didn't ask about Marcus. She didn't ask why I came back to Cedar Falls or why my aunt had turned me away. She simply made extra portions at every meal, left prenatal vitamins on the bathroom counter without mentioning them, and once, when I came downstairs at 2 in the morning because I couldn't sleep, she was already in the kitchen making chamomile tea as if she had been expecting me. Can't sleep either? I asked. Rarely, she said. 30 years in emergency medicine ruins you for normal hours. I told her that night, in pieces, about Marcus, about Portland, about the way things had unraveled so completely that I sometimes couldn't trace back to where the first thread had pulled loose. She listened without interruption. When I finished, she said, "The hardest part of being capable is that everyone assumes you don't need anything." I thought about that for a long time. I found part-time work at the walk-in clinic on the edge of town. The receptionist position wasn't what I'd trained for, but it paid enough to contribute to groceries and it kept me moving, which Dot said was important. She drove me to every prenatal appointment without being asked, waited in the parking lot with a book and a thermos of coffee, and on the way home always stopped at the bakery on 2nd Street for something she called medically necessary. "I'm a doctor," she said, every single time. "Trust me." The baby was due in late April. The flooding started in early April. The rain had been building for days, the kind of steady, determined rain that soaks into the ground until the ground refuses it and sends it back up. The Rogue River crested its banks on a Thursday night. By Friday morning, the low roads were underwater and the county had opened the high school gymnasium as a shelter for families displaced from the south end of town. Dot drove us there to volunteer. She set up a triage area near the bleachers with a folding table and a medical bag that seemed to contain approximately everything she had ever needed in 30 years of emergency medicine. I worked beside her, checking in families, directing people to cots, bringing water. It was sometime around noon when they brought in the man and his daughter. A rescue team had found them on the roof of a farmhouse on Sycamore Road, about 3 miles outside town. The father was in his mid-30s, dark hair, soaked through, a gash on his forearm from where he'd caught it on the guttering climbing up. He was carrying a little girl who looked to be about 2 years old, wrapped in a rain jacket that was several sizes too big for her. The girl was shivering and silent in a way that was more alarming than crying would have been. Dot moved toward them immediately. "Set her down here," she said, already pulling out her stethoscope. The man set the girl down on the exam table Dot had established. His hands were shaking, he didn't let go of her hand. "She won't talk," he said. "She hasn't said anything since the water started coming up. She was talking fine before that." "How long were you on the roof?" "About 4 hours. Dot listened to the girl's chest, checked her temperature, examined her eyes. "Hypothermia is mild," she said. "She's in shock. It's normal after something like this. She needs warmth, fluids, and time." The man's name was Owen Marsh. His daughter's name was Lily. He was a contractor who had moved to Cedar Falls 2 years ago when his wife's parents needed help on their farm. His wife had died 14 months ago. "Ovarian cancer," he said it quietly, the way people say things they've had to say too many times. He and Lily had been living on the farm with her parents, but her parents had evacuated to her aunt's house in Medford 3 days earlier, and Owen had stayed behind to try to protect the livestock. "The water came up faster than I expected," he said. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, he was just speaking because standing still with all of that inside him was worse. I brought him a dry shirt from the donation bin and a cup of coffee. He looked at me the way people look when they're so depleted that even small kindnesses require a moment to process. "Thank you," he said. Lily had fallen asleep on the cot wrapped in 3 blankets. She still hadn't spoken. I sat nearby because there was something about her silence that I didn't want to leave unattended. I didn't know why. I was 8.5 months pregnant, and my back was aching, and I should have been sitting on the other side of the gymnasium with my feet up. But I stayed. After about 20 minutes, she opened her eyes and looked at me. I didn't say anything. I just looked back. She reached out one small hand from under the blankets and laid it on top of my stomach. Owen, standing nearby, made a sound I couldn't quite describe. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, something in between. "She does that," he said, voice rough. "She likes babies. She's welcome to it," I said. We stayed like that for a while, Lily's hand resting on my stomach while I sat beside her cot. Owen stood at the edge of the cot, watching his daughter with the focused attention of a man who had learned that the world could take things from him without warning and who was not going to look away. My own water broke at 11:47 that night, in the gymnasium, surrounded by flood evacuees and folding chairs. Dot delivered my son in a partitioned corner of the high school gymnasium with a volunteer nurse named Carmen assisting, and approximately 60 displaced Cedar Falls residents pretending very hard not to listen. The power flickered twice. Someone kept a generator running for the medical equipment. Owen Marsh held my hand for the last 40 minutes because Dot needed both of hers and I needed something to hold on to, and he was simply there, and steady. The way some people are steady when things go sideways, not because nothing scares them, but because they've learned that someone has to be. My son was born at 1:16 in the morning. He was loud and pink, and furious about the entire situation. I named him James, after my mother's father, who was the only person in my family who had ever made me feel like I wasn't a problem to be managed. Dot held him while Carmen cleaned him up, and she said, without looking up, "He has your stubbornness already. Look at that expression." I laughed until I cried, and then I just cried, because I had been waiting for a very long time. They moved us to the small medical room off the gymnasium for the rest of the night. Dot stayed. Owen brought me a plate of food from the volunteer table at some point close to dawn and set it on the chair beside me without saying anything. Lily was asleep against his shoulder, her fist curled in his collar. "You should rest," I told him. "So should you," he said. Neither of us did. In the morning, the rain had stopped. The roads were still flooded, but the water had peaked. The shelter was beginning to thin out as families found places to go. Dot drove James and me back to her house and put us both to bed in the guest room and stood in the doorway for a moment before she left. "You did well," she said. Coming from an emergency physician who had spent 30 years not saying things unless she meant them, I understood what that cost her, and I held it like something valuable. James was 3 weeks old when Owen's farmhouse was cleared and he and Lily returned to it. The in-laws were still in Medford. The farm needed work. He came by Dot's house one afternoon to return the shirt I'd given him at the shelter, which he had washed and folded with a precision that suggested he had been raised to return things in better condition than he received them. Lily came with him. She walked straight past both adults, found James and his bouncer on the living room floor, and sat down next to him with the serious, proprietary air of someone who had decided this was now also her baby. Owen and I stood in the kitchen while Dot made coffee and pretended she wasn't watching all of us. "How are things at the farm?" I asked. "Getting there." He was quiet for a moment. I wanted to say thank you. For the shelter. For sitting with her. She sat with me, really. He looked toward the living room. Lily had taken James's hand and was showing him one of her toy animals. Narrating something in a low voice he was far too young to understand and seemed entirely happy to listen to. "She hasn't done that with anyone," Owen said. "Since her mother." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything, and somehow that was the right answer. He came back the following week with a bag of produce from what had survived of the farm garden. The week after that, he came with Lily because she had asked to see the baby. After a month, The visits had no particular reason attached to them anymore. They were just visits. Dot watched this development with the neutral expression of a woman who had strong opinions she was keeping to herself. One evening after they left, she refilled her coffee and said, without preamble, "He's a good man." "I know," I said. "He's also clearly terrified of saying the wrong thing." "I noticed." "Claire," she said, in the tone she used when she was about to say something she'd been sitting on for a while, "you are allowed to have things. Not just responsibilities. Things. Warmth. Company. Someone who shows up." I looked at my coffee. "I know. Do you?" I thought about Marcus. About how I had mistaken availability for love, presence for commitment, a shared address for a shared life. About how completely I had misread the room for 4 years. "I'm not sure I trust my own judgment," I said. Dot considered this. "Your judgment got you here," she said. "Through everything. I'd trust it a little more than you do." Summer came quietly to Cedar Falls. James learned to hold his head up, then to roll over, then to grab things with the single-minded determination of someone who intended to put everything he touched directly into his mouth. Lily taught him to clap by clapping at him until he imitated her. She was enormously proud of this. Owen filmed it on his phone and stood in the kitchen doorway watching the footage 3 times in a row. I found a position as a nursing coordinator at the regional clinic. It was part-time, which suited James's schedule and mine. Dot watched him on the days I worked and charged me nothing, which I argued about and she ignored. "Consider it rent," she said. "You've been here 7 months. You owe me approximately nothing and James owes me about 140 smiles, which he pays consistently." I called my Aunt Ruth in September. I had been thinking about it for months, going over what I might say. Trying to work out whether she owed me something, or I owed her something, or neither of us owed anyone anything, and we were just 2 people who had lost the same woman in different ways and had never talked about it. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Claire," she said. Not surprised. Like she had been expecting this call too. "I'm not calling to fight," I said. "I know." Silence. "I was scared," she said finally, in a voice that sounded like it had come up from somewhere very deep. "When you showed up here like that, you looked so much like her. And she came home pregnant and alone, and I thought I could save her, and I couldn't. I thought if I—" She stopped. "It doesn't make it right. What I said, what I did." "No," I said. "It doesn't." Another silence. "I heard you had a boy," she said. "James. Is he—" She paused. "Is he doing well?" "He's perfect," I said. "Stubborn and loud and completely perfect." She made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I didn't invite her to visit. She didn't ask." But when I hung up the phone, something that had been sitting on my chest for 29 years shifted, just slightly, to the left. Not gone. Just lighter. The letter from Marcus arrived in October. It came in a plain envelope with my name typed on the front, which was so quintessentially him. He would type his name on an envelope he could have handwritten in the time it took to open the laptop. I set it on the kitchen counter next to James's cereal and a half-eaten banana, and I finished feeding my son and I washed the dishes before I opened it. It was 3 paragraphs. He had been doing some thinking, he wrote. He'd talked to a therapist, which was good. He should have done that years ago. He understood that he had handled things badly. He was in a better place now. He was wondering if I might be open to a conversation, because he kept thinking about what we had built together, and he thought maybe he'd been wrong to walk away. He did not ask about the baby. Not once, in 3 paragraphs, did he ask about James. I read it again. I set it back on the counter. Owen came by that afternoon with Lily and a box of apples from the farm. He found me on the porch reading the letter again, turning it over in my hands like maybe the words would rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. He sat down in the other chair without asking. He waited. "Letter from the baby's father," I said. He didn't say anything. "He wants to reconnect." I folded the letter. "He doesn't mention James." Owen was quiet for a long moment. Down the hill, Lily was chasing Dot's dog around the yard, delighted and losing badly. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I don't know yet." "That's okay." He watched Lily. "Take the time you need. You're not going to tell me what you think I should do?" He glanced over. "No. You know what you think, you just need to catch up to it." I looked at him. The way he was sitting unhurried, solid, not going anywhere reminded me of something Dot had said months ago. Someone who shows up. That night, after James was asleep and Dot had gone to bed and the house was quiet except for the sound of the wind off the valley, I sat at the kitchen table with 2 pieces of paper. To Marcus I wrote, "James is doing beautifully. He's healthy, he's happy, and he is surrounded by people who chose to be here. I don't think what you're describing is something I can go back to, and I don't want to. I wish you well, and I mean that. But this chapter closed when you put my lease on the table instead of your hand." I didn't mail it that night. I slept on it, which is what my mother always said to do with anything important. In the morning, it still said exactly what I wanted it to say, so I walked to the mailbox and sent it before I could think myself out of it. My Aunt Ruth visited in November. She stood at the end of Dot's driveway in a long coat, holding a bag from the bakery on 2nd Street, and she looked both exactly as I remembered her and somehow older, softer around the edges. I watched her through the kitchen window for a moment before I went to the door. She came inside and sat at the kitchen table and held James for approximately 30 seconds before her entire face changed, the careful, composed expression dissolving into something unguarded and real. "He looks like her," she said softly, meaning my mother. "I know," I said. "We didn't have a dramatic reconciliation, we didn't undo 14 years of distance over coffee and bakery scones. But we talked for 2 hours, and when she left, she said she would call, and 3 days later she did. Not everything heals cleanly. But some things begin. Owen asked me to dinner in December. Not as a casual visit, not with Lily along as the social buffer she had been cheerfully providing for months. He called the night before and said, "I'd like to take you to dinner. Just the 2 of us if you're open to it. No agenda. Just dinner." I told him I was open to it. He picked me up on a Friday evening. We drove to a restaurant in Ashland, nothing fancy, a place with exposed wood beams and good wine and a fireplace that had been burning since October. We talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with children or floods or Portland or grief. He told me about growing up in Montana and why he had always wanted to build things. I told him about nursing school and why I had always wanted to fix things. We discovered that we had both lost people we loved in our 20s and had both made the mistake of thinking that keeping moving was the same as healing. On the drive home, the valley stretched out below the ridge road, and the winter stars were very clear and very close, and I thought about how many times in the past year I had been in the exact wrong place at exactly the right moment. He walked me to the door. He didn't push for anything. He said, "I'm glad you came back to Cedar Falls," and I said, "I didn't think I was. But I think I am now," and he smiled, and the porch light was warm behind me. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like I was standing at the edge of something about to fall. Winter turned. James turned 8 months old and learned to pull himself upright by gripping the edge of furniture and looking enormously pleased with himself. Lily started kindergarten and presented him with a drawing of their first meeting, which she described as the day I found my baby, and which Owen had framed and hung in the hallway of the farmhouse. Dot hired a part-time assistant at the clinic and reduced her own hours for the first time in 30 years. She said it was about time. She also adopted a second dog, an elderly basset hound she named Dispatch, who immediately became best friends with the golden retriever in the way that mismatched companions sometimes find each other without explanation. I moved into the farmhouse in the spring. Not because of any grand decision or romantic declaration, but because James had essentially taken up permanent residence in Lily's playroom, and it seemed inefficient to keep driving back and forth. Owen converted the sunroom off the kitchen into an office for me. He did it while I was at work one Saturday, and when I came home, he was painting the window trim and he said, without turning around, "I figured you'd want the light on that side." He was right. He was usually right about things like that. I kept the room in Dot's house too, Because some transitions deserve to be made slowly, and because Dot said the dog missed James and she wasn't above using emotional leverage. There was an evening in May that I come back to when I think about what it means to end up somewhere you didn't plan. Owen and I were sitting on the porch after the kids were asleep. The valley was going gold in the last of the light, and the apple trees in the orchard were in bloom, and Lily had left her boots on the top step in a way that suggested she had very important plans for them in the morning. "Do you ever think about Portland?" Owen asked. "Sometimes," I said. "Less than I used to." "What do you think about it now?" I looked at the orchard. At the boots. At the light. Fading over the ridge. "I think it was the right place to leave," I said. He reached over and took my hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. That was the thing I had been learning all year, slowly, the way you learn the things that matter, not all at once, not in a moment of clarity, but in accumulation. In the silences that aren't empty. In the doors that open when you're not expecting them, in the children who lay their hands on you like you are something worth reaching for. James would never know the version of me that drove into Cedar Falls on $43 and the reluctant faith that somewhere there was still a door that hadn't closed. He would only know the version that remained, the one who stayed, who built, who chose. I thought, sometimes, about what I would tell him when he was old enough to ask how we ended up here. I thought I would tell him the truth. That I was lost. That I was scared. That a woman I didn't know opened a gate in the rain and made me a cup of tea without conditions, and that sometimes that's how your whole life turns. I wrote it down that night, all of it, in the journal I had started keeping in Dot's guest room the week I arrived. I wrote it because I am a person who needs to understand things by putting them in order, and because I had a feeling that one day I would need to remember what it felt like to be at the bottom of something and still find a reason to knock on the next door. Not because the story was over, but because it had finally, truly, begun.